Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Pedalshift Project. The Pedalshift Project is a series of conversations, thoughts, and experiments on bicycle travel adventures. From tips and tricks to ideas on how to ride your ride, let's shrink the world by bike. Show notes and more are available at pedalshift.net/346, and you can email the show at pedalshift@pedalshifted.net or text me at 202-930-1109 and check Pedalshift out on all the socials as well. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 346th edition of the Pedalshift Project. My name's Tim Mooney. Thanks so much for joining. A very happy holiday season to you all. We are now in the teeth of the holiday season. Gizmo's super excited, as you can hear. That may or may not be a problem for the rest of this recording session here, but we'll see how it goes. On this edition, we are going to be doing a little bit of a follow-up on last episode's eBikes episode with Biking Brian. Got a ton of listener comments on that, and so I thought I would do a bit of follow-up on that. And then the topic of this episode is going to be on slow travel and how we can integrate that into our bicycle adventures. First up, following up on e-biking adventures with Biking Brian. First of all, again, another huge thank you to Brian for joining the show. It was really a fascinating discussion. And of course, you know, I will often listen to these episodes and now, of course, watch them. And when I do video from time to time, I will watch them. And yeah, it was just really fun to kind of hear it again, watch it again, and a lot of questions kind of came up, and Brian and I actually did a little bit of emailing back and forth. It was also one of maybe the highest engagement episodes that I've had in, I might even say years, just in terms of the amount of comments and amount of emails that I got. So it clearly was sort of tickling your amygdalas out there, for lack of a better way of putting it. So you know we're going to end up talking more about e-bikes, I think. I just, as I mentioned in the episode, I do think that there is some degree of e-bikes having a major part about bicycle travel in the future. And you may not have an e-bike as your primary bike, but I think that more and more people are going to have e-bikes as maybe, I don't know, car replacements. People, as they age into their lives a little bit more, will maybe want that little bit of pedal e-assist. It may become a more common thing in everyday bicycles as we go along here. So I do think it's something to keep our eye on as we go forward here. I wanted to mention a few things that I got in terms of listener feedback. The thing that I think was the most important was I got a little bit of pushback on the notion that current commercially available here at the end of 2023 bikes aren't able to tour. And one thing that I think that I want to clarify perhaps is commercially available bikes can absolutely do all sorts of different types of bicycling adventures. And the reason why I know that is because a lot of you wrote in to tell me that. And that's absolutely true. I think what I was saying on that episode, by the way, if you haven't listened to it, it's episode 345 of the Pedalshift Project. Also, the interview is on YouTube as well on the Pedalshift channel. Definitely check it out. I think what I was saying is that the type of rig that Brian has with the ultra high capacity battery that can do literally 100 miles, that is not really commercially available. But I'm not even sure if that's 100% true. But the type of system that he's got is still one of those roll your own types of things at this point, at this time. And I do think that that's probably changing. As many of you who wrote in noted, you can absolutely use the current commercially available bikes that are rocking out 48 volts or any of the variety of battery capacities in there. And I'm conflating a few things here just to kind of prove the point here. You don't need the ultra high capacity battery to be able to benefit from the e-assist. You could set the e-assist setting very low and still have some kind of a benefit. Many of you are riding e-bikes where the bike itself is not some gigantic tank and you can ride without battery assist for many, many miles, turn on the pedal assist only when you need it. For instance, up inclines or towards the end of a day or anything along those lines, or where your pedal assist is really, really actually quite minimal and it just sort of sips on that battery throughout the day. Some other folks mentioned that you can go through an entire battery, but you'll bring along a second fully charged battery. And then that gives you plenty of capacity to do a 50 or a 60 or a 70-mile day. And so I think that that's also a part of all of that. On the other side of the spectrum, there were a couple of folks, and I will say that this was definitely in the minority, who really, really scoffed at the notion, or maybe I shouldn't say scoffed, were very skeptical of battery capacity for certain types of bicycle travel. And I think that that makes sense. An e-bike is not going to do really well in a big climby day where you're gaining 10,000 feet of elevation and you're going 100 miles. I mean, yeah, that's kind of file under duh. The battery capacity is going to be limited, and when you're going to be going up some pretty steep terrain, that's going to burn down the battery a lot. I think that that's an old school notion of thinking, though, because I think that the bikes are getting lighter, the batteries are getting better. And while there's certainly use case scenarios where an e-bike would not be a really good idea, think about, we have Capital Bike Share in DC where we have e-bikes. You may have them in your city too. They are built like tanks. They are very heavy bikes, and they're not super fun to ride without the e-assist. In fact, the pedal assist kicks in automatically with those. Yeah, that would be a bad bike to be doing any kind of a long distance tour on, especially if you're carrying a bunch of stuff, if you're going up big grades and things like that. Or maybe it's fine because maybe you're only going a couple of miles. I think that for those folks, I would say the right e-bike is going to match your needs. And yes, there are definitely use cases where, let's say you're going on a real backcountry kind of tour and you're not going to be able to recharge. Well, of course, an e-bike would not be a super great choice in that. But I think rather than saying, oh, e-bikes aren't good in every single scenario that I can think of means they're not suitable for bike adventures, I think that's a wrong way of looking at it. Just like any kind of tool, it's the right tool for the right job. And the right e-bike, I think, would fit a lot of different types of tours that a lot of people are looking at. And I think all you have to do is look at what Brian's doing, and you can see that there's a lot in the realm of possible for using an e-bike to really extend your range, your personal range, to be able to do big ticket tours in a fraction of the time. It's very exciting from where I'm sitting, quite frankly. One thing that I also want to get into is to underscore the part where we had a little bit of confusion. Brian was talking about there's lots of different ways you can categorize e-bikes, but the thing that we spent a bunch of time on and that I had to kind of drop in my echoey voice was the difference between a hub-based system, which is on the wheel, and the mid-drive system, which is in your bottom bracket. The mid-drives, as Brian mentioned, are more efficient. And as I dug into it a little bit more after last episode, they're shockingly simple to install. Yes, you've got to have a bottom bracket tool to be able to kind of remove your current system, but it literally does just slide in there. It is not very complex to do. And there are a ton of different brands. They are all sort of built, you get them and you just slide them in. It is much easier to install them than I ever thought that they would be. That seems to be a really interesting thing. I also want to mention one other thing, or kind of follow up on one other thing that I'm not sure was really as obvious, but this has to do with Brian's system. He was talking a lot about fast charging. And without getting too technical in here, the bigger your battery, the faster you can charge that battery. In other words, you can have again, if you think of electricity as coming in with a pipe, you can have a bigger, wider pipe of electrons flowing into your battery if it's a bigger, higher capacity battery. It just has to do with the nature of how batteries recharge. So the reason why that works is because he built an enormous battery. That means that he can flood that with a particular fast charger with a ton of electrons and therefore get on the road that much quicker. If he had a smaller battery, which is what is the more commercially available ones, you can't charge those as fast. So you can't get as many miles of effective range added if you've got a smaller battery. So that's just kind of how things work right now. The interesting thing is, and he and I talked a little bit offline as well, and this I think is worth mentioning here in the follow-up. He brings two chargers with him because when you use that that really fast charger, that's going to potentially degrade. It's not great for batteries to do that all the time. Again, I'm really yada-yadaing it a little bit here. It's a lot better if you do it at a slower pace. You're not just literally putting a fire hose on it. You want to do the garden hose, not the fire hose on your batteries. That's probably a good way to look at it. So he brings a smaller, more adjustable, more finesse type of charger. And that's the one he used in Fort Plain. If you've been watching his videos, he was able to plug in overnight. That's what he does in hotels as well, where he can get an overnight slow charge. When he's on the road and he needs to get range added in quickly, when he's eating lunch, for instance, he pulls out that fire hose of a fast charger. So that's the type of thing that you use situationally to do the types of things that Brian is doing. Really fascinating elements to all of this, and also a really interesting way of looking at what kind of battery choices that you would want to make. So if you, as Brian does, want to be able to add range as quickly as possible, you want a gigantic battery. Or flip it around, if you want to have a high range, you could have smaller batteries, but you'll want to bring spare batteries and want to be able to swap those things out. So a lot of different ways that you can look at it, but hopefully that makes a little more sense to you. It took a little bit of listening and kind of understanding for all of that to kind of sink in for me. So again, tons of different options that are out there for you. The tech is now very mainstream, in terms of just go on Amazon and you can find mid-drives and you can find hubs and you can find all sorts of different things by a variety of different brands. Frankly, a lot of them are just kind of, private labeled and they're manufactured by the same folks. But that tech is really mainstream and really accessible. As I mentioned before, it's become easier and easier. I don't think you need to be a bike mechanic level of acumen, nor do you need to be an electrical engineer to pull all of this off. But, go on your YouTubes, watch a bunch of videos, figure that all out. And I think that that's going to be something that many of us can do in the very near future. Of course, there's also a lot of commercially available bikes. There's a lot of bike shops that are starting to specialize in this as well. So I don't want to ignore the local bike shops that are doing that too. So lots of really interesting things. The battery capacity to weight ratios are getting better all the time. This is a section of the bicycle industry, for lack of a better way of putting it, that is changing rapidly. And I think that things are really, really getting to be a paradox of choice, which is why I thought it was a really good idea for us to talk about it here on the show. So thanks for indulging on the follow-up. We will be talking about this more in 2024. Next up on the show, and if I sound different, it's because Gizmo was being such a cranky pants. I literally had to stop recording and go to a different place. So apologies for all of that. Next up on the show, we're going to be talking a little bit about slow travel. And, this is something that's kind of new to me in terms of voicing it, but I think that it's something that I would maybe like to do more of, or at least to think about it more when I talk about my bicycle travel. I think that slow travel is exactly what you would expect it to be just by the name itself, that you're not focused on any rushing. You're not trying to get any place necessarily fast, which frankly, bicycle travel already has sort of baked into the cake compared to other modes of travel, of course, but also to think more about the fact that you're not going to be trying to maximize your distances or maximize your ability to travel either. And I think that that's a key component to at least something that I would like to be looking at more in the future here. I think that when it comes to all of this, you're looking at more of the classic line of embracing the journey, not just the destination. And for many of us who have been doing this for a while, not all of us, but many of us, me included, I think that a lot of what I've been doing has always been, I'm going to start at point A, I'm going to define a point B, and I'm going to get there as fast as I can. Not necessarily that I'm racing to get there, but I have a certain number of days and I'm trying to maximize that. So I really end up pushing myself physically to do the 60 or even 70 or even more miles in a day, which I think is also why I've been so attracted to eBikes in a lot of ways. Because most of us don't have an unlimited amount of time for our touring or our bike packing or our other kind of bicycle traveling adventures. So that's kind of a piece of all of that. And I think for other folks, you do a better job of this, of saying, oh, look, it's the C&O Canal. Sure, I could do it in 3 days like other people with podcasts do. But you know what would be a lot more fun would be to really focus in on the history and all the towns. And maybe I'd take a week and do this. And maybe I'm not doing much more than 20 miles in a day, but that allows me to kind of see the sights a little bit more. It allows me to spend half a day in Shepherdstown. It allows me to spend a half a day at one of the crazy bars by the towpath or something like that. Lots of different opportunities there, I think, in embracing that kind of journey. And I think that leisurely pace gives you more time to really enjoy it, quite frankly. It's not that the cycling itself isn't enjoyable. I really like banging out a 60-mile day. That's always been my sweet spot. But I think on some days when it's like, it's kind of a push to do that, at the end of the day, maybe, getting in the shower and getting a good dinner, that's sort of the reward for the day. But there's not a lot of day left to maybe indulge and see what town I'm in. I can't tell you how many times I've been to, for instance, Lakeland, Florida. Lakeland, Florida has been an overnight for me on many of my Florida adventures in Central Florida, but I don't really know it very well because I've never really had much of a time to spend in it. I've biked through it multiple times. I know it pretty well by bike, but I don't know it in any other context with the occasional, I think, burger mixed in for times that I've stopped to eat. So I do think that the more leisurely pace gives you the benefits to be able to, I don't know, for lack of a better way of putting it, have a deeper cultural engagement, better exploration of the cities, the towns, the places that you end up going to. And I think that if you end up going into a tour, I've talked about this before, about sort of defining your goals before you go into any kind of a bicycle tour or any kind of bicycle travel. By doing that, you can maybe say, you know what, I really would like to actually have a chance to spend some time in these places. And many of you smartly, I think, schedule 0 days in these types of places, not just for recovery, but also to really explore and relax and enjoy a place. I think that's a real benefit of slow travel. I don't do that very often. And I have to be honest, I think as I start thinking about the close of 2023 here, and of course, next year, we're going to do bicycle touring goals again early in January, I think. And this might be something that I consider for a future tour. Because I've been giving this a little bit of thought over the last few weeks and kind of in context for what I'm thinking about for 2024, I thought it would be useful, or at least worth sharing, what my thoughts are in terms of planning a slow tour. And that's kind of what I've been calling this: slow travel, slow tour. I think it fits whatever mode of bicycle travel that you do, bike packing, bike touring, whatever. I think the first thing you want to be thinking about is you really want to be focused in on the itinerary. And that kind of makes the most sense of all. Your speed is one thing, but sort of where are you going? Where are you going to be making the most of this kind of more slow paced type of approach to things? So itinerary is going to be a really big thing. Your route, which is kind of part of the same thing, but I do think routes are really important as well when it comes to the slower paced tour. Slower does not necessarily mean easier, I think would be another thing that I would say. A route that you take that might be considered a slow tour could also be a very vigorous one with like really, really big inclines. I'm thinking of a lot of you that are in the backpacking frame of mind as well. There are some really amazing ones. And I think I've been getting a lot of folks who have been mentioning their routes to me in the bikepacking perspective. I cannot remember the acronym here, but it was basically a route in Pennsylvania from the north to the south. And I think that's the direction it went. But, there are some really, really vigorous climbs and all of that. Now, you don't necessarily have to do that in a fast-paced way. That would certainly be a rigorous way of going with that kind of a route. But you may take it in a slow way. You may take that. It could be done maybe in a few days, I've seen on some YouTube videos, because, of course, I got interested in the whole thing, of course. But, you could drag it out to be a couple of weeks long and maybe kind of shrink down the mileage. But these are still going to be really, really big climbing days that would be in there. So, just because it's considered a slow tour does not mean it is necessarily an easy tour when all is said and done. But I will say that a slow tour in concept is probably something that is going to focus more on shorter daily distances when all is said and done. And there's a bunch of benefits to that, regardless of what age you are. I think the big thing is something I've already talked about before. If you're not going to be cycling as long during a day, it gives you more of an opportunity to do all of the other ancillary things that come along with bicycle travel, to go and visit those places, to connect with people, to connect with friends maybe. It just all depends. The other things that are the add-ons to your bicycle travel as well. But I do think that as I am starting to notice, I won't say changes in my body, but like it is definitely impacting me more when I go out for longer, more kind of like robust rides. The concept of adding in rest days is something that I really haven't done before. I've always been, I have 7 days to do this and I have 7 days available and it's just going to happen. I've kind of ameliorated that a little bit with fast forwards, which is of course another tool that you can use. But I do think that the ability in the slow travel mindset to bake in a rest day, it's going to be good for recovery. It's going to be good for all sorts of different reasons as well. And for many of you, you're like, Tim, of course, that's why we do rest days. That's why we do 0 days every 3, 4, 5 days. What have you been doing? Well, ride your ride, right? I also think that keeping your schedule flexible in one of these scenarios is another consideration too. Now, you know me, I am very, very upfront about being, Virgo planner kind of guy, right? And that's just sort of my nature. But I do know that many of you love to have a much more flexible schedule. Some of you as much as point the bike in a direction and go, and that's sort of your travel, that's your tour. You have a sense of it, but you don't have any specific plans beyond a day or so. Even going back to Brian again from earlier in the show, Brian had things planned out for a couple of days. And then beyond that, he was kind of on the fly. I wish I could do that more, to be honest. I think maybe someday I will try to do that. Maybe I'll do a whole tour that way and be very uncomfortable and nervous the whole time. But I think in the slow tour context, especially if you choose your route properly, if you choose that in a space and a place where you know what? It doesn't matter whether I do 20 miles or 40 miles or if I do 10 or 60, I'm going to have a place that I can stay. It's going to be either maybe easy camping or there's a variety of places you're in an environment where it's real easy to get an Airbnb or a hotel or something like that. Roofed lodging, as I like to say it. That's the kind of thing that maybe the slow tour, if you pick the right schedule, gives you more opportunities for as well. One of the things that I think goes hand in hand with bicycle travel is the concept of minimalism. I was in Portland this past weekend for my brother's round number birthday. We won't say what it is because it makes me feel extra old. But in any event, he's my younger brother. So of course, when he gets to a certain age, I feel even older. The idea of minimalism came up when we were talking. He was thinking, sometimes I think about what it would mean to live with a whole lot less. Like, how could I do that? How would I make that work? What if I had to fit everything into just my car? And it was really interesting because as he was saying those things, I was like, dude, I do that all the time. I do that multiple times a year. I live just fine with the things that I can carry on my bicycle. And I carry so much more than a lot of you do. You would look at what I do and you think I'm carrying everything but the kitchen sink. When you look at bike packing and the true minimalist travel there, it's really remarkable how many shades of gray you can have in all of this. I think that minimalism is a real core value to bicycle travel, but even more relevant to this concept of a slow tour as well, because we're really looking in at honing in and reducing not just what we're carrying so much, but really what we're expecting in a lot of ways. We are not trying to jam a million things into our trip. We're able to kind of look at the simpler things. We're, really going to dive into the nature of one particular town rather than blow through it and maybe grab lunch. No, we're going to really get an idea of what that town is like. Maybe even, hang out with people, talk to people, go to a bar, things like that. I think that that's a really important nature of the planning of a slow tour, that minimalism is, whether you're thinking of it or not, whether it's a core value of yours or not, I think it's a core component of both bicycle travel, but more specifically here in the slow travel space.
So a bunch of the different benefits, now that I've kind of talked about what it means to plan that kind of a tour and the core values within that kind of a thing, what are going to be the benefits that I see from slow travel? First, I've said it before, connecting with the locals is definitely one thing. And that is something that I feel like I've really been missing in a bunch of my trips recently. I feel like I'm always kind of in a rush. Even when I end up having a conversation with people, I get annoyed because they ask me how much my bike weighs, right? I mean, these are things we've talked about before. It really shouldn't annoy me all that much. I really should be more focused in on the conversations, right? So I would like to, I think that's something that is a part of slow travel. I don't feel like I need to get away because, clock's ticking, I'm going to lose out on something if I stay here and have this deeper, meaningful conversation with somebody who's interested in what I'm doing. That's the kind of thing I think that's helpful and a real benefit. I think that you have even more of an opportunity to savor the local environment that you're in. One thing that I love about the C&O, for instance, is that around every single bend, there's just a little bit more nature. And there's all of these different opportunities to kind of connect with the way the river flows in a particular area. How does the canal behave? What are the birds that are coming in? Maybe you're lucky and you see something a little bit more exotic, who knows? But to be able to kind of sit there and kind of just soak it in a little bit more rather than thinking, I've got 35 more miles and I need to go. That is something that I think is a really, really helpful thing to really experience what it means to sit there for a little bit and just soak it all in and just see what else is going on around you. And I've been talking about that in terms of wildlife, but that's true in terms of people too, quite frankly, and just how the space that you're in behaves. And I think that that's another real benefit there. I think that the benefits of having a low impact on your surroundings can't be overstated. I'm not sure if slow travel does a better job of this compared to a more typical speed kind of bike tour or bike packing adventure. But I do think it's something to underscore as a part of bicycle travel in and of itself. We're all concerned about climate change, and we know that we have a carbon impact on what we do. I know I'm particularly mindful of the fact that when I fly someplace to go on a bit of bicycle travel, that there's definitely a carbon impact to all of that. So, I've done some carbon offsets, and I think I'll continue to do that in the future. But that matters to me. It doesn't matter to everyone, and I'm not saying it should matter to you. Again, we always say ride your ride, but that's a piece that's important to me, at least. And so I think having a low impact on your surroundings and making sure that obviously the carbon footprint's one thing, but also to ride responsibly. Again, this is something that I would say for every single bit of bike travel, but I think it's a factor to consider as part of all of this. It's certainly a reason why I do bicycle travel as a piece of what I do over maybe some more carbon intensive things. I think that we talked about this more at the top of this discussion here, smelling the roses and really understanding the places that you visit all the more. I think that I have grown to know and appreciate some places in my tours more on subsequent visits as I've sort of grown to know them over time. And I think one of the reasons why it sometimes takes multiple visits is because I'm rushing through them a lot, quite frankly. So I think that this is another way to kind of maybe get to know a town a little bit more. I'll be honest, I think I've thrown a few towns under the bus for not being, for being a little sketchy or whatever. And then, in subsequent visits, I've sort of grown to say, well, yeah, there's certainly some parts of town that are a little sketchy, but a lot of it is maybe understanding kind of what the deal is in that area, understanding what are the pressures of people in that area, et cetera, et cetera. I'm thinking about Eureka, California as a great example here. There's great parts of Eureka. I tended to bike through some parts that were a little sketch and had interactions with some sketchy people. But, the reality is Eureka's got some other stuff going on too. It's complex, and that complexity is really interesting. If I get to spend a little more time there, maybe I would have figured that out a little bit more quickly. Last but not least, this is something that I think I'm going to do as a larger topic next year at some point, and that's the concept of mindfulness as part of your bicycle trip. Again, this is not a therapy podcast by any stretch of the imagination, but as I think I mentioned before, my partner Kimberly is a therapist, and she also was a yoga studio owner, and I was a lawyer for a yoga studio for a time. And so mindfulness as a practice has been kind of surrounding me a little bit. I'm kind of terrible at it, but that's why they call it a practice, not a well, anything else? So I do think that it's something that I would be interested in maybe having a discussion about on a particular episode. But the idea of being very present and being very intentional with how you approach things from a mindfulness perspective. And I'll get into all of that a little bit more later. And if you're sitting there going, oh, that's a little woo-woo for a bicycle touring podcast, well, I get that. But trust me, I'll try to make this as accessible as possible for folks. But I do think that staying present is something that everyone can benefit from, whether we call it mindfulness or not. So anyways, more to come on that. I think, like I said, that's more of a larger episode, but I do think that slow travel goes hand in hand very well with the concept of staying present and mindfulness and what that all means. And again, we'll talk more about that in a future episode. So those are kind of my thoughts on slow travel and how that intersects with bicycle travel a lot. And I hopefully that's it maybe sparks some interest in what you're thinking about in terms of your travel. Maybe it's the way that you've always approached bicycle travel. It's something that I would like to integrate more in 2024. And again, just like how we talked about how we'll be talking more about e-bikes, you're probably going to hear more about slow travel. Maybe not as specifically as this, but it's going to be integrated, hopefully, in some of my future travel. And I think that there's a lot to be gained from a trip like that. You don't always have to travel like that. You can mix it in as some of the things. I think that I always will like my kind of, hey, I got 3 days and I want to do the C&O kind of a thing. That will always be there. But I think I would like to do the slow travel model or practice the slow travel model at least once next year and maybe more. We'll just have to see. I'm kind of intrigued with the whole concept. Folks, I do want to add one more thing, and that is next week is the Pedalshift Holiday Spectacular. Now, in past years, we've had me basically, right? This year, we do have special guests. It has just been recorded. It is going to be an actual spectacular. I'm here to tell you. It's going to be a little bit of the fun, whimsical stuff that we've had in the years past, but it's also going to be a fun discussion as well. And I'm really excited to share that for you. That's going to be coming next week. I want to say at the top here, happy holidays to everyone as we enter into the kind of robust nature of the holiday season here in the US and around the world. Thank you so much for being part of the show, and I'm really looking forward to closing out the year with the Pedalshift Holiday Spectacular. I think I might even have one more episode after that before the end of the year. But anyways, off we go. Happy holidays, everyone.
And as always, we like to close out the show with a special shout out to the Pedalshift Society. Because of support from listeners like you, Pedalshift is a weekly bicycle touring podcast with a global community. Expanding into live shows and covering new tours. If you like what you hear, you can support the show for $5, $2, or even $1 a month. And there's one shot and annual options. If you're not into the small monthly thing, check it all out at pedalshift.net/society. On to the society. Kimberly Wilson, Caleb Jenkinson, Cameron Lean, Andrew McGregor, Michael Hart, Keith Nagel, Brock Dittus, Thomas Skadow, Marco Lowe, Terrence Manson, Harry Telgadas, Chris Barron, Mark Van Ram, Brad Hipwell, Mr. T, Nathan Poulton, Stephen Dickerson, Vince LaGreco, Cody Florchinger, Tom Beninati, Greg Braithwaite, Sandy Pizzio, Jeff Muster, Seth Pollock, Joseph Quinn, Drew Porter, Byron Patterson, Joaquin Robert, Ray Jackson, Jeff Fry, Kenny Mikey, Lisa Hart, John Denkler, Steve Hankel, Miguel Quinones, Alejandro Aviles Reyes, Keith Spangler, Greg Towner, Jody Zaranen, Lucas Barwick, Michael Baker, Brian Bechtal, Reinhard Bigel, Greg Middlemiss, Connie Moore, William Gothman, Brian Benton, Joan Churchill, Mike Bender, Rick Weinberg, Billy Crafton, Gary Matushak, Greg Latoile Lopez, James Sloan, Jonathan Dillard, John Funk, Ronald Paroli, Dave Roll, Brian Hafner, Misha LeBlanc, Ari Messenger, David Kropke, Todd Grossbeck, Wally Estrella, Sue Reinert, John Lico, Stephen Granada, Philip Mueller, Robert Lackey, Dominic Carroll, Jackie McCullough, John Hickman, Carl Presseau, David Neves, Patty Louise, Terry Fitzgerald, Peter Steinmetz, Timothy Fitzpatrick, Michael Lazuski, Hank O'Donnell, David Zanoni, David Weil, Matthew Sponsum, Chad Reno, Spartan Dale, Carolyn Ferguson, Peggy Littlefield, Lauren Allensmith,
Eric Burns, Thomas Pearl, Darren McKibben, Richard Stewart, Dave Fletcher, Jack Smith, Luke Parkinson, Ryan Patterson, Sarus Faravar, John Gardner, Sam Scruggs, Dwight Pittenger, Connie Bowder, Rob Merrifield, and thanks to all past and anonymous folks for helping make this show happen.
Thank you for joining. You can find Pedalshift at pedalshift.net for more great bicycle touring content. You can hear the Pedalshift Project through Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his self-titled album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Mono Mono, wherever cool music is available.